Hello and welcome to the Therapy Circle with Tiffany Petite, co-founder of Virtuous Circle Counselling. This podcast opens up about experiences, challenges, and triumphs that are often discussed in therapy, all while bringing you insightful reflections from a therapist's perspective. We're diving deep into authentic conversations, but before we dive into today's episode, it's important to note that while our discussions are rooted in therapeutic principles, they are not a replacement for professional therapy, and the information shared in this podcast is for informational purposes only. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the Therapy Circle. I'm your host, Tiffany Petite, and I'm joined today with Beatrice Valmana Crocker of Virtuous Circle Counselling, and today we're going to talk about intimacy. Welcome, Beatrice. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Tiffany. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
My pleasure. Yeah. So let's talk about intimacy. So, off the top, intimacy is defined as deeply personal connection between individuals, right? That often encompasses emotional, physical, intellectual, and sometimes spiritual dimensions between people, right? It's a mutual sense of trust. So I'm really excited to understand your experience supporting couples or clients, both in individual and couples sessions, and what you've seen your clients sharing and how you might support on this topic.
Totally. Like you say, I think intimacy is such a common topic that comes up in sessions with clients. And I mean, we see everything on the spectrum from clients who are proactively working on their relationship and strengthening their intimacy to the other end of the spectrum where a couple's intimacy may have completely eroded. And I often find that, like you say, there's so many different types of intimacy. But the ones that I find that people often present to therapy with in terms of having some issues, it does tend to be that physical and sexual intimacy as well as emotional intimacy.
Do you think that sex goes hand in hand with emotional intimacy, and oftentimes that's a disconnect for people?
Totally. I really do think there is a very strong connection between the emotional intimacy and the sexual intimacy of a couple. Yeah.
And so speaking in terms of like sort of heterosexual couples that you might see, or even same-sex relationships, do you think there's a difference in how partners define, from your experience, whether it's a male partner versus a female identifying partner, how they define feeling close in the relationship?
Yes, I do think there is that difference. I think men can often think of intimacy as sexual intimacy and that physical closeness, where women are maybe a little bit more likely to include emotional intimacy in their definition. Do you have a similar experience?
Yeah, like I think sometimes I think men feel like, at least the couples that I've supported, men feel like you kind of have to have the sex to feel validated, to feel close, and women don't necessarily feel that they want to have the sex before the closeness and intimacy. So sometimes the road to get there is often varied depending on the person's perspective of what sort of defines their sense of closeness to the other partner.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that is important and I often see is what makes somebody feel wanted and desired. And that can often be different with men versus women. And for men, feeling desired is more of that sexual intimacy and what is associated there. Whereas for women, being wanted, being desired tends to refer more to feeling heard, feeling seen, and feeling supported.
Can you give me some examples about, what gets in the way of those like sort of seemingly simple concepts, right? To be seen, to be heard, to be understood. How might that sort of get a wedge in between people from sort of breeding and cultivating that sense of connection, do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a few different things. Stress is a big one. There's life changes, so becoming parents, for an example. lack of communication is a big one. So not necessarily talking and knowing what your partner wants and needs. And then also, unfortunately, just sometimes it's time and length of time in a relationship, and that effort towards maintaining the relationship, it slowly disappears.
Yeah. So tell me more about that. Like, and I think I find that as well. Like sometimes people, have been in the relationship for, many, many years. And they've often seemingly had this sort of disconnect for quite some time until they feel like, maybe they need to come to counseling, or they maybe need to like bring in a third party to kind of hear each other's sort of perspectives. Why do you think that sometimes people perhaps wait too long before they recognize this is a problem, whether it's communication or that sense of connection over time?
Right. I think, again, a few different reasons. One is, in the beginning of the relationship, typically relationships are characterized by passion and wanting to spend all your time together. And I'll often ask couples that of when they're having issues to think back to the beginning of the relationship, like, what did you used to do together? And their answers will typically be like, we would talk for hours. We were always together. And then as life gets in the way, more and more things come up and you have different responsibilities, and that time together and really knowing each other's internal worlds, it slowly slowly decreases. Again, communication is a big one, and it can be really hard to maintain communication throughout life and throughout life stressors, right? And so I think often couples will have challenges in, like, a suggestion I'll often give will be to have a scheduled time to talk, and that will feel like a big ask, whereas at the beginning of the relationship, they would want to do that and they would be willing to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And what strikes me kind of like as curious, like, and I find that in the same sense is like sort of being intentional with your partner. And sometimes people think, scheduling even sex or scheduling a connection is sort of like the last priority on the to-do list, right? And, as a mom myself, sometimes, you're balancing and juggling all the sort of like to-do list, right? Sort of like between managing hobbies and interests for your kids and trying to like have something for yourself. It just seems like it always seems to be that's the one thing that people kind of compromise on, yet it's the thing that brings them into the session, right? Like making intentional time to foster and breed deep intimacy.
Absolutely. Totally. And it's worrying in a way, because I'll have some couples come in and they'll say that the couples therapy sessions are the only times that they really get to talk about any of these things. And I think that really highlights the importance of dedicating time. Like couples therapy, it's a dedicated time to talk about your relationship. And sometimes if you do that, or all the time, if you were to do that in your own life outside of therapy, a lot of these issues might feel less severe.
You got it. And I think like also to complement what you're saying is like there's no distractions, right?
Yeah.
We don't have phones on, we don't have TVs on, we don't have people interrupting, or I call it jailbreaking into something. Sometimes when you have young kids, you can barely keep two sentences together without somebody needing something. And life just really gets in the way, right? So like what would you say is like your approach to, when clients or partners identify that they want something like this? Like what do you think that you will utilize to start introducing these strategies? And like where does that draw from?
So I guess in terms of enhancing communication, is that what you mean?
Yeah, and breeding intimacy.
I think in terms of intimacy, I would say that a good sexual connection is built on emotional intimacy and closeness. And emotional intimacy, it requires spending time together and talking. So many couples, they haven't talked about non-problem or non-boring things in so long. So their conversations, they really are just about bills or work, kids, other stressors. So obviously those things are important, but they can't be the sole topic of conversation. So I would say you've got to dedicate time in your week, in your day, whatever that looks like, to talking about your relationship. So what is going well for you? What did you really appreciate? Is there anything that's bugging you? Are your needs fully being met? And of course, like I say, it's important to talk about the problem things and the boring things, but also talking about your relationship is equally as important. So yeah.
Yeah, you got it. And I want to like I guess add to what you're saying. So oftentimes, and I think you've nailed it, there's some conversation killers, right? And these are the things that stifle good communication, right? Like sort of building on that momentum of closeness and true deep connection. And so I will use things in my practice that draws from the Gottman method, and particularly the 4 horsemen. And if you're not familiar with it, the 4 horsemen is essentially sort of, I call them like the landmines of really stifling meaningful discussion. So if you're trying to connect and build intimacy with your partner and there's any areas of contempt, right? So those are like sort of the nonverbals. Those are like eye rolling, maybe like turning or looking away, or contempt is sort of like judgment, right? In what that person's saying, belittling. So just sort of speaking to your partner with sarcasm or disrespect, mocking them. Anytime there's criticism, so that's another horseman. It's like that you're attacking that person for who they are, right? So defensiveness, major stifler, and stonewalling. So a lot of people shut down, right? If you have something really meaningful to say and that partner just sort of like gives you the silent treatment or avoids it, or they feel really overwhelmed by what you have to say, oftentimes those are I guess periods of time where couples sometimes they don't breed that intimacy. Like, what are your thoughts on those 4 horsemen? Again, stonewalling, defensiveness, contempt, and
absolutely,
and criticism.
I think absolutely, like they're so common, and I think particularly criticism and defensiveness, those are ones that very often you will see with couples. Contempt, I think, like John Gottman's research, he showed that, or he found that contempt is the biggest predictor of divorce. So as soon as I see that, I say that is something that needs to be addressed right away. And then stonewalling, that's a really interesting one, because I think that evidence says a partner may be feeling overwhelmed and they're in that hypoarousal state where they just shut down, and often their other partner can feel like they don't care or they're not interested in continuing that conversation, when really they might be. They just don't have the ability or the capacity at that point to have the conversation. So it's really understanding, okay, yes, your partner might be stonewalling and shutting you down, but is there something else that's going on for them? And maybe do they need time to self-soothe and bring themselves back to a point where they're able to have that conversation?
And like, what do you do, like if you find in your practice that couples seem to be like arguing over and over about the same thing, that is stifling that intimacy, that like that is sort of the point of like that barrier, that invisible wall. How do you kind of navigate that in your sessional work?
Right. So that's an interesting question, actually. I think sometimes one point I think about is, or I'll ask the partners or the couple, is this a problem that is going to exist in your relationship and that you're going to have to accept? And that really is a very personal and individual choice. And I can't be that person that tells you, and also your partner can't be that person that tells you. However, I think what helps in that is seeing your partner potentially being willing to try to work on that particular issue. And if you see some compromise, and maybe it's not necessarily fixed or changed to the extent that you'd like it to be, but if you see that your partner is willing to make an effort towards compromise or towards better meeting that need that you might have, I think that's a really important point. I also think it really depends on the extent
Yeah.
of the issue.
Yeah. What are some common issues that you think that many couples that you see are challenged with, that they just seemingly can't get over, that's getting in the way of fostering that intimacy?
Right. A big one is mismatched libidos, so desire discrepancies. That is one that I see very commonly, and it really does create this fight in the relationship that then ends up seeping into all other areas of the relationship. And it's a really challenging
Yeah.
one, and I really do empathize with couples that struggle with this, and it's a lot of work to get to a point in where it works for both people, but it's definitely possible.
Yeah, you got it. So basically what you're saying, when somebody wants more sex and the other person's like seemingly okay,
Yeah.
satisfied, fine, and that person's sort of on the hook for feeling like something's missing. Is that
Yeah,
right?
exactly. That's exactly it.
That'd be really challenging,
Yeah,
right? And
absolutely.
so, and I think yeah, and I think that like that sort of presents a challenge, right? Like what do you think about, and I've seen this many times in my practice, when somebody sort of like their readiness for change, the readiness for engaging in more intimacy in the relationship is, they're generally content with how things are, but the other person's sort of like, they're longing for it, they're striving for it. What are sort of the like risks of not being aligned in the shared desire to see the problem the same?
Lots of risks for sure. I think it often will lead to feelings of frustration and feelings of rejection for at least one of the partners, if not both of the partners. And like I say, it tends to be this source of conflict that then it really does present in many different areas of the relationship. And then ultimately, I'd say the biggest risk is potentially infidelity.
Yeah. And tell me more about that. Like, so is that something that you've seen, that, somebody may have stepped out of the relationship for these sort of like unmet needs? Like, why do you think people experience infidelity in a relationship that they're otherwise, seemingly, committed to?
Right. I think infidelity, I
Big
think one,
question.
yeah, right, totally. I think one thing to really think about first is infidelity and what people define as infidelity. It's so subjective. So for one person, it might be their partner watching pornography, whereas for another person, it might
Yep.
be their partner forming like a deep and personal connection with somebody else outside of the relationship when there isn't necessarily that physical aspect between them. But I do think at the core of infidelity and defining it, it's the secrecy, it's the lies, right? So if you're doing something that's kept a secret from your partner, then that is typically a flag for there's something that's not quite right there. In terms of your question about what leads to infidelity, it's a big question, like you say. I think typically it'll stem from a whole bunch of different things. There can be individual factors, there can be the relational dynamics, and then sometimes there can even be those external circumstances. So I guess in terms of individual factors, that could be low self-esteem, feelings of inadequacy, and seeking that validation and the attention to make themselves feel better, even if they do really deeply care for their partner. I think another one can be potentially sexual addiction. And then in terms of the relational dynamics, that often stems from what we were talking about there. And it's really important not to use this as sort of like a blaming or justifying, but really just as a explanation for why it occurs. But I do think that when couples, they stop prioritizing their connection and their intimacy, I mean, they become vulnerable to one or both of them feeling undesired and unseen, neglected, unheard. And that's where infidelity can then become this sort of misguided attempt or escape to meet needs that feel neglected in their relationship.
Yeah, beautifully put. I love what you said. And I think like I want to go back to what you said, and I think that's a good sort of measuring, right? Like, so, what are we hiding from our partners, right? Let's
Right.
talk about that secrecy.
Mm.
We inherently seem to know when there's something that we know is going to cause a conflict, right? And if we tend to stonewall and we want to avoid difficult conversations, those are elements that breed secrecy, whether it's even like shopping or purchasing things without transparency. But it's about our actions and behaviors and what we're hiding from our partners, right? And I think what like do you think that's about avoiding the fight, or is that about meeting those unmet needs to that we're holding those secrets?
I think it can be both, or it can be either, really. And so I think if it's a secret, then potentially it's something that you and your partner might have already talked about, and your partner has already defined those boundaries and said, that's not something that's okay with me. And that's why you feel like you can't tell them, or you don't want to tell them. And then from the other side, it might be not wanting to have that difficult conversation, and not wanting to even go there.
Do you feel like that creates a power imbalance when somebody has a need and their partner says no? How do you navigate that in session when it feels like that's still something that's important to somebody that the other person's not willing to compromise on? Like porn,
Yeah.
let's call it. Like, what if somebody just enjoys pornography, but that just inherently makes the other partner feel violated, insecure, like, their partner is, being deceitful or not honoring them?
Right. And I think
Big
that's,
question.
yeah, again, again, I think that really comes down to understanding why that is an important thing for your partner, and understand, or I guess from both sides, even like why your partner wants to watch pornography, or what they feel like that helps them with, or whatever that looks like. And then also for the partner that maybe is not okay with it, understanding and really understanding why they're not okay with it. And that can go back to so many different factors. It can be, there may be trauma, there may be past experiences of infidelity that somehow relate to pornography. It can be feeling like it just does not align with their values. I think another really important point with pornography that I see is this unrealistic standard that porn can create for men and women to live up to. And I think for men, there can be the consequence of performance anxiety. And for women, again, it's that like self-consciousness, and their self-esteem can be affected. And again, body image can be a factor. So really understanding maybe those deeper issues and why maybe your partner isn't okay with it. I think that really fosters empathy and understanding, and that will help to come to some sort of resolution potentially on how the two of them move forward.
I love that. And I want to like kind of like build on that. Like, what is the power of empathy in relationships of any kind?
Right.
What do you think?
I think empathy, it's at the core of all relationships, and really understanding your partner, right? Because I think we can all relate to that experience of somebody's listening to you, but not really feeling listened to. And that's where, empathy can go a long way of, okay, that you're listening, but do you really understand how your partner or what your partner is trying to convey to you, or why they feel the way they do? And that can lead to those deeper conversations, that deeper understanding. Because I think that is an important point, right? Of like, if you can have actual understanding before you move to a resolution, then the resolution is something typically that both partners will feel more satisfied with, and it will feel like an actual compromise, rather than just saying like, yeah, I get what you're saying, but not truly understanding it.
Yeah, you got it. And if somebody's like, I don't know how to empathize, or what does that really mean? What might you suggest somebody like try, or what would you suggest that you could do, or a strategy that somebody could do to really sort of understand somebody else's experience in that pain, in their
Perspective
partner's
taking.
pain?
I think perspective taking would be the first attempt or sort of exercise that I would try of really working to paint the picture of what your partner is experiencing and then putting themselves in those shoes and verbalizing, expressing, okay, this is how I might feel in this situation. Like, is that maybe how you feel? And if it's not, then that's okay as well, and you can't force it. But being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, it really is an important skill. And I think something that is so important in relationships for both partners.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Are you familiar with Esther Perel?
I am. She's excellent.
I love Esther. I love her. So what do you like about Esther, and like how would you I mean, just for those who might be listening, she's a renowned psychotherapist, and her research and experience really explores the topic of intimacy and that dynamic balance between our human needs of connection and autonomy. But she really sort of argues that true intimacy requires that balance between closeness and distance. So I'd love to kind of, while we're on the topic of empathy, how would you think, how would you invite your clients to remain curious and maintain the desire in the relationship, like Pearl suggests, but not really about, needing to share everything, but cultivating some mystery and unknown aspects of a partner. Yeah.
Right. And I think that sort of relates to her idea of, she talks about how we now have this sort of expectation that your partner serves as every single role that typically a whole village would fulfill, of being, say, person who contributes financially, a person who is a support system, a person who makes the food, cleaning, everything, all these different roles, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it's a big expectation to put on somebody. And I can understand two sides, really. Like, I understand people who agree with Esther Perel. I also understand people who maybe don't. And I think it really comes down to, if having your needs and being able to communicate those needs to your partner, if those needs aren't able to be fulfilled, how do you go about meeting them? And are there ways of meeting needs that maybe don't, I guess, move towards that sense of independence, right? Of, are there other ways you can fulfill them? And particularly for people, for example, who want to spend all their time with their partner, and that's, say, a need for them. Sure, that, I mean, it might work for some couples. For other couples, it totally might not. And that's okay as well. And so I guess that would be for the partner, maybe that wants to spend all their time with their partner. Maybe they need to look at how they can fill their time doing things maybe more independently, or finding a group of friends that they can do things with. So I agree with her perspective of how the expectation that your partner can fulfill every single need is a very high one. I'd be interested to know your perspective, Tiffany, actually.
Yeah. Like I to be honest with you, I find that she does a phenomenal job. I love her book, State of Affairs.
Yeah.
And I actually worked closely with people who've had affairs in relationships, breaches of trust. And, from the partner who may have been, let's say, the person who experienced the affair, and the person who was on the receiving end of an affair, I think it draws from a really unique perspective from both sides, and it does cultivate some of that empathy. And I've had many people who've worked through affairs that sort of walk through those pages and have come out of that affair that much stronger, and building the blocks of fostering trust and repair through an affair, which can be damaging and detrimental. But, you know, I think for me, I do agree that I think sometimes people lean into relationships with this sort of romanticized idea that the movies are real, that you know, they have this idea that relationships should be a certain way, and when they feel, let's say, disconnected from their partner, they're not necessarily anticipating the work and the effort that it comes from making a choice to build connection, and that there could be space for our inherent needs that may or may not be possible from, like you said, one single person to fill our cup. And it really requires us, in my opinion, to really balance the need between closeness and independence. But through that, in my perspective, comes from respect and people really encouraging each other to be, through friendship or through bonding, our best selves, being a champion for the other to become who they want to be without our ego or our interests interfering with allowing that partner to really retain a sense of individuality. And I think what she says is that truly does fuel attraction. That does fuel curiosity. And it revitalizes that routine feeling of things feeling stagnant. So I really love what she has to say about like growing, like individual growth as a foundation for togetherness. But I do lean into repairing trust is essential to building intimacy. And I think you know, John and Julie Gottman talk a lot about in their research about the repair after, you know, trust has been damaged and strained, right? And so that's, in my opinion, those are sometimes the reasons why people might be fighting over and over about something that they haven't necessarily repaired.
Right.
What do you
Absolutely.
think?
I think that's a great point. So I guess maybe when that situation hasn't necessarily been labeled as an infidelity, there's still been something where the trust has been broken, and it does still require that repair process. I think that's a great point, and I think something that many couples can probably relate to.
Yeah. And like, and sometimes we think that trust is, you know, a black and white issue. Like what would you define as a, how would somebody know if you're working with a couple, how would you know there's an underlying fear, or a breach of trust that's getting in the way of cultivating intimacy?
Good question. I think there's a few different indicators, right? Of maybe one partner says, they don't know if that person is always going to be there, if they can't picture their person in the future. I think another really important point is when they say that they trust their partner in different aspects. So say in managing the household, managing the finances and childcare, but they don't trust them in being able to provide them with that emotional support. I think that is a huge factor of trust. It's so multifaceted, and there's so many different aspects of what goes into trust between two people.
I couldn't agree more, right? And so where do you think, like, from my experience, like, I think some of those do come to attachment styles, right? Like, and some of those earlier experiences of feeling safe in a relationship, and how somebody sort of rebounds from trust based on those early experiences. Is that something that you found as well in your work with people?
Absolutely. I think it's really interesting, actually. I think there's some common patterns of how people might respond to a breach of trust or to infidelity based on their attachment style. And so, for example, one would be somebody maybe with an anxious attachment style. So they have that fear of abandonment. They have that fear of rejection. They initially are seeking that closeness. So during the crisis phase, they're like, it's okay, we can figure it out, we can work through this. And I mean, it's maybe a little bit rushed, and they haven't necessarily taken that time to process. And then unfortunately that comes up at a later stage, where they do still have those really intense and emotionally charged feelings that they haven't been able to process during that crisis stage. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do you suggest? Like if you find that like one partner maybe overcome with sort of their earlier experiences and their like the way that they developed in their attachment style based on their, childhood experiences, what do you suggest if that might be getting in the way in the couples work that you might be providing?
Right. So typically I think that it depends on their own sense of awareness and that individual person's sense of awareness. So are they aware of maybe why they have developed an anxious or avoidant or anxious avoidant, the combination of disorganized attachment? Do they know how to communicate those needs that they have as a result of their attachment style to their partner? And I think if the answers to those questions are no, then I would typically suggest individual therapy sessions and building that awareness first before going into couples therapy sessions and working on it there.
Yeah, I agree. And do you find that these are things that couples, like what can couples do to sort of lay a good foundation into, managing expectations? Like, because that's all the warm fuzzies, right? It's the sort of the honeymoon period when people sort of engage and like sort of set the tone for the way that their relationship begins. Like, what are some of the things that people can do outside of like the warm fuzzies of like a really exciting, hot, passionate, potentially exciting start to a relationship? What can they do to build intimacy, true deep intimacy outside of that?
Right. I think talking about or getting to know your needs would probably be first. So getting to know yourself and knowing how to communicate that to your partner. And then when you're at that point, then absolutely talk about it. And I think one idea that I love is it's that emotional bank account. So know what adds to your bank account and what drains from it. And then being able to communicate that to your partner. And then when you know what adds and drains your partner's emotional bank account, focus on doing one small thing a day that adds to their bank account. Just small rituals like that, I think can be a fantastic start to laying the foundation for a relationship.
Yeah. And you know what, like you had me kind of think about, and this is sometimes the challenge that I see in my sessions is people always talk about the love languages. Yeah. And people seem to be really familiar with the love languages when they come into session, right? They'll I know like and they'll bring intimacy, sexual intimacy as this is my love language. I am a physical touch person and my love language is not being met. And I think that's sort of used, I don't want to say weaponized to be like, I need my love language met, but they're not really sort of understanding that that might not be your partner's love language, right? And that's not the way that they feel close to you. And so I think oftentimes that people don't understand about the love languages is that we give the love languages often in the ways that we want to receive them.
Totally.
Right, from our partners. And that's where the disconnect is. We're totally overlooking that our partner is actually a quality time person and not a physical touch person, but we're giving our physical touch because that's really how we want our emotional bank accounts to be filled. Yeah. And I think that's not often discussed enough as like why that's not working. That concept is not working.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important point and something I see couples get stuck in that dynamic all the time of, well, my partner isn't able to meet my needs, so I'm not going to work on meeting their needs. And then, then they're stuck. They get stuck. And, right? And then it's like, well, what's the point? What are you working towards? And if one person can break that cycle, and they're like, okay, even though that person or my partner isn't meeting my need yet, I'm still going to try and do something to break this cycle that we're stuck in. And I think what people find is once you break it, the other partner slowly will follow on. And there you go. But people are stubborn and they get stuck.
Yes, they are. Yeah, because they're angry, they're hurt, they're resentful. They want, they feel like they're going to give what they feel they got back. And it sort of like creates this sort of cycle and pattern of rules of engagement with people. And so I agree with you. It really requires people to sort of get unstuck by kind of removing our ego a bit.
Yes.
And just sort of opening up about what's the crux. Yeah.
Totally. That's exactly it.
Is there do you think that there's anything that we haven't discussed that you think it's important for people to know?
I think one thing that I would say is I often will tell people communication is so important. And then I will find that people don't even know where to start. So when they haven't talked about these topics before, so something like sex, for example, where when I'll say you need to talk about sex, get to know what your partner likes, they don't even know where to start with that conversation. And so what I suggest for that, therapy is a great option, of course. If therapy is not an option that's possible, or one partner isn't willing to do yet, there's so many conversation cards for that. And I think Gottman, they have a great free app that I suggest to people all the time, that it's called the Gottman card deck. And there's so many questions on so many different topics. There's like sex related, there's future related, value related questions. So use some of those conversation cards to get that conversation going. And once you're able to start, then it becomes a lot easier to keep it up.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's their play on love mapping, like building love maps. But I agree, like, and sometimes, like you might not know the questions to ask your partner, but it certainly opens up, again, sometimes finding out something you think you know, but you actually don't. And I love that, right? I think the other thing I would add that I find in my experience in session is that people, they think, after long periods of time of being with their partners, they think they still know the same person from 10 years ago, but because they're not asking those questions, they make assumptions about their partner. They make assumptions about how their partner might feel or think based on who they thought they knew 10 years ago. Yeah. And so, like, what are your thoughts, Beatrice? Do you think that that's something that you find, or people making like assumptions about their partner and they actually don't know?
Absolutely. And I think that it really maps onto the Gottman idea of keeping up to date with your partner's love maps. So knowing your partner's internal world. So what you used to know about them, sure, there's probably parts that still are the same, but also there's going to be things that are very, very different. So keeping up to date with knowing your partner's internal worlds, I think that is an incredibly important point.
Awesome. I agree too. And I think we just need to make space for that, but we need to make space. And again, recognizing the landmines, those things that get in the way that stifle effective communication and really breed a barrier to really feeling true, deep intimacy with your partner.
Yeah.
And so
absolutely.
is there, like on final thoughts, I just want to thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I know we're only just scratching the surface and this is such an important topic and I'd love to explore that further, but I just want to thank you. Is there anything else that you think it's important the listeners want to leave with, or takeaways that you think it's important?
I think we've covered it all. Main points, I would say communication and spending time together. Those would be my final tips.
Yeah, you got it. Awesome. Awesome. Well, thanks again. And I look forward to seeing you continue to support people and thanks again. I really appreciate your time today.
Of course. Thank you so much, Tiffany.
Thank you for spending your valuable time with us. Remember, everyone's journey is unique, so what works for one person may not work for another. Take what resonates with you and leave the rest. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and review. If you'd like to learn more about us, please visit bccounselling.com.
Go get